Remove the veil. 2 words, and they hadn't even come through the open doors yet. The king's voice reached the altar before his body did, low and absolute, and the entire cathedral seemed to stop breathing at once. Dorcas felt the command land against her skin, like a hand closing around her throat. "Don't shake! Don't shake! Don't shake!" Her fingers found the stems of the bouquet she didn't remember being handed, and gripped until the petals bruised. Because if that veil came up, and the Alpha King of the Northern Dominion looked into the wrong face, the treaty was void before a single vow was spoken, and a voided treaty meant Rivermoon burned before sunset. A marriage. A treaty. The last price the Rivermoon pack could pay to avoid being erased from the map entirely. 6 months ago, Rivermoon's border had fallen in a single night, and King Blackwood's forces hadn't even needed a second wave to take it. Peace, in the end, had cost exactly 1 daughter. Duskmere Cathedral had stood for 300 years. Its stone ribs held up windows of colored glass, scattering red and gold light across 1,000 watching faces. Alphas from every pack in the Dominion filled the pews in ceremonial fur and silver chain, and every single one of them was watching the veiled figure at the altar, like she might catch fire. Among them sat rulers from kingdoms that had once been Luke's enemies, and a few who still were in everything but name. They hadn't come for a wedding. They'd come to see whether the Alpha King's famous control would finally crack, or whether Rivermoon's gamble would hand them an opening. Somewhere behind her, a Rivermoon elder had gone grey in the face. A child clutched a parent's sleeve, too young to understand why grown wolves were shaking inside a house of stone and glass. Her father's pack, what was left of it. The gown wasn't hers. It had been made for her older sister, narrower shoulders, a longer waist, and it hung on Dorcas wrong in a dozen small, telling ways. Anyone who looked closely enough would see it. She was praying no one looked closely. Serena's gown, Serena's wedding, Serena's war to end. Except Serena was 3 kingdoms away by now, and Dorcas was the one standing at the altar wearing her name. Her father's grip was still fresh on her wrist from an hour ago, tight enough to bruise. "If the king discovers we deceived him, Rivermoon burns," he'd hissed. "Keep your eyes down. Say nothing. Let the veil do its work." He hadn't asked if she was afraid. He hadn't asked if she was willing. He never had. Not once. Not in her whole life. Not until the day he needed a daughter nobody would miss. Funny, Dorcas thought, eyes fixed on the toes of borrowed slippers peeking from beneath the hem. How invisible I was. Right up until you needed something to feed a monster. She almost laughed. It seemed safer than the alternative, whatever was clawing up her throat instead. The great doors swung wide on hinges older than the treaty itself, and the cold that rolled in wasn't just weather. Every candle down the long nave guttered at once, as though the building itself had exhaled. She didn't need to see him to know he'd arrived. She felt him first, a pressure rolling down the aisle ahead of his footsteps, pressing into her skin like a breath held too long. The whispers died. Even the stone seemed to lean in. Alpha King Luke Blackwood walked into his own wedding, the way other men walked into a war they'd already won. Black ceremonial coat, silver wolf sigils stitched to the collar, dark hair, a jaw carved from patience worn thin, and eyes the color of struck gold, the kind that made seasoned alphas suddenly find something else in the room to look at. An attendant's hand lifted the veil from her face. Cool cathedral air touched her skin for the first time in an hour. So this is the monster I'm supposed to marry, Dorcas thought, hating that even inside her own skull, her voice shook. Just survive the ceremony. Smile. Don't let him see you shaking. Luke stopped mid-stride. Something in his chest turned over, hard and sudden. A key finding a lock it hadn't known existed. Mine. The word wasn't his. It rose from somewhere lower, older, the wolf beneath his skin, surging up for the first time in his life to claim something before the man attached to it understood why. He didn't move, and it had nothing to do with the unfamiliar face now bared to him under 1,000 watching eyes. A voice had just spoken inside his skull, and it hadn't been his own. It came from her. He had heard fear before. Deception. dressed up in silk and good posture. Every alpha in that cathedral had tried to hide something from him at some point, and he had always known. But he had never heard a thought. Not once. Not like this, clear as a bell struck an inch from his ear. For one wild second, he nearly said so out loud, in front of the entire Dominion. Instead, he shut his jaw and let the ceremony carry on around him like water around a stone. The priest's voice rolled through the opening rites, oblivious to the silence stretching taut between the king and his veiled, now unveiled bride. Old words about duty, about moons, about bonds sealed in front of witnesses. Dorcas mouthed her responses on instinct, barely hearing herself. Every nerve braced for the moment his hand would rise and expose the lie in front of 1,000 alphas. Luke barely heard a word of it either. He was watching her, the way a man watches a fire he can't quite explain, and doesn't especially want to put out. Why is he staring at me? The thought arrived sharp, laced with dread, and this time Luke answered out loud. Quiet. Meant only for her. Because you're thinking too loudly. Dorcas went cold to the bone. For one horrible second, she thought she'd misheard him. Then understanding dropped through her stomach, like a stone through ice. He can hear me. He can actually hear me. Oh, moon goddess. He knows everything. She braced for the accusation, for his hand seizing her arm, for guards, for her father's screaming, for River Moon, burning exactly as she'd been promised it would. Instead, Luke turned to the priest, and in a voice that carried to the very last pew, he said 4 words nobody in that cathedral expected. Continue the ceremony. No one moved. No one breathed. Behind her, she heard it start anyway. The low murmur of 1,000 alphas, trying to make sense of a king who, in his entire reign, had never once been merciful without a reason. Her mind was a storm of half-formed questions, each one crashing into the next, before she could hold on to a single one. Wait, Dorcas thought, too stunned to hide it, even if she'd wanted to. That's it? You caught me lying at the altar of your own wedding, and you're just going to let it happen? She had no way of knowing that on the other side of the veil that no longer hid her, a king who had never once in his life been surprised by anything was standing very still, listening to every unguarded thought in her head, and finding that he didn't want her to stop. The final vow left her lips in a whisper, and the priest pronounced them bound before the moon goddess and the Dominion entire. Dorcas barely heard it. She was still waiting for the floor to open beneath her. It never did. Luke took her hand, not seized, not gripped, just took, like it was already his to hold, and led her back down the aisle, past 1,000 alphas too stunned to whisper. Someone near the front finally exhaled a name. Half the congregation seemed to brace for the executioner's call that never came. Whatever this was, it wasn't the massacre they'd been promised, and no one dared trust it yet. He knows, Dorcas thought, climbing into the waiting carriage on legs that didn't feel entirely hers. He knows, and he's taking me somewhere private to finish this properly. Luke settled across from her as the carriage lurched into motion, and said nothing. Maybe kings don't execute people in carriages, she thought, studying the velvet seats, the gold fittings, anything that wasn't his face. Too much blood on the upholstery. Maybe there's a room for that. A special execution room, with a rug you can roll up after. A sound escaped him. Short, rough, almost a laugh. Quickly killed. Dorcas froze. He heard that. I hear everything, Luke said quietly. You should know that, before you keep planning my decorating. Tradition had lowered her veil again for the walk back down the aisle. A bride leaves as she entered, hidden, whatever waited beneath already decided. But here, with no one left to perform for, Luke reached over and drew it back himself, slow enough that she could have stopped him. She didn't. He studied her the way he might study a wound, before deciding how badly it needed tending. Fear, first. She couldn't have hidden that if she'd tried. Then the fine tremor of exhaustion under her skin. Then her wrist, where 4 fingers had left a bracelet of bruise just hours old. The gown gaped at her shoulders, hemmed for someone with 3 more inches of height, and beneath the incense and old stone of the cathedral, she carried nothing. No cloud of imported perfume, the kind every bride of consequence wore to her own wedding. Luke's jaw tightened. Where is the woman I was supposed to marry? Dorcas's chin came up. You married her. I married a veil. His eyes didn't move from hers. Try again. She held out a few more seconds of silence, chin high, and it cost her everything she had left. Then his eyes narrowed slightly, listening, and she understood. There was no version of this where he didn't already know. She's gone, Dorcas said finally. 2 nights ago. Wherever your bride actually is, it isn't here. And you? My father needed a substitute. The treaty wouldn't notice. I was the only daughter left standing in the hallway. Convenient, really, she thought, before she could stop it. 22 years of being invisible, and it finally turned out useful. He could scent it now, this close. No dominant undertone beneath her wolf, nothing that announced itself. Omega. In most packs, that made a daughter decorative. In hers, apparently, it had made her expendable. They sent you because no one would miss you. It wasn't a question. She didn't bother denying it. He'll send me back now, Dorcas thought, already composing the walk into Rivermoon in disgrace. Damaged goods, returned to sender. No, Luke said. She blinked. No? Then why keep me? The thought slipped out before she could catch it. Raw, more honest than anything she'd said aloud since the doors opened. What use am I to an alpha king? Something shifted behind his golden eyes, a low, wordless thing coiling tighter the longer he looked at her. Beneath his skin, the wolf paced, restless, already circling the idea of her like something worth guarding. It didn't care about treaties or timing. It only knew the shape of what it had found, and had no intention of giving it back. Because my wolf has already chosen you. The words landed strangely, half warning, half confession, as if he hadn't quite believed them until he heard himself say them. Chosen me for what? Her voice came out smaller than she wanted. Luke leaned forward, and the carriage seemed to shrink around them. The space between his knees and hers, suddenly the only distance in the world that mattered. You are my mate. Silence swallowed the carriage whole. Dorcas heard the word land somewhere behind her ribs, felt it settle like a stone dropped into still water, and understood, with a slow, dawning horror, that her entire life had just changed shape, without once asking if she was ready. Dorcas didn't remember the rest of the carriage ride, or the walk up the palace steps. She remembered the word mate sitting behind her ribs the whole way, refusing to make room for anything else. She'd braced herself for what came next, a court that would swallow her quietly, the way Rivermoon always had. Servants who'd flinch when she reached for something. Nobles who'd smile with their teeth and nothing else. A cold, silent marriage in a cold, silent palace. Instead, Luke walked her past 100 watching staff, stopped at the top of the grand stair, and said, "This is your future queen. She will be given a suite befitting her station, and she will be treated as such." Then he left no room for argument. He gave her a suite with windows facing the eastern gardens, a fire already lit, and a door no one entered without her word. It was the first room in her life that had ever belonged to her alone. The staff obeyed him. The court did not. By the second morning, Dorcas understood exactly what she was to them. An omega, a weak wolf in a crown that fit no better than the wedding gown had. A settlement, not a queen, worth nothing at the table, and therefore worth nothing at all. At breakfast on the third day, one of them said so aloud. Lord Ashbrook, broad-shouldered, self-satisfied, an alpha who'd sat on the council since before Luke's father died, set down his cup and studied Dorcas the way a man studies a stray that's wandered somewhere it doesn't belong. "Tell me, Your Majesty," he said, addressing Luke and not her at all. "Does the settlement speak, or only sit there?" The temperature in the room dropped. Something old and dangerous rose behind Luke's eyes. For one heartbeat, gold bled through them, more wolf than man, and his chair scraped back an inch before he'd decided to move it. "Don't," Dorcas thought, fast and sharp. "Don't defend me. If you tear apart every alpha who insults me, you'll have a civil war by lunch, and I will have started it before I've even unpacked." Luke's jaw worked. Then, to her genuine astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched. fighting something that wasn't rage at all. "She speaks," Luke said evenly, "when it's worth her time." Ashbrook, uncertain whether he'd just been insulted, said nothing further. It became a pattern faster than Dorcas expected. Luke heard things she never meant to say aloud. The nights she'd gone unfed as a child, because an Omega ate last, if she ate at all. The quiet fear that she would never be enough, for this palace or any other. The running commentary of sarcasm she kept up about tapestries and titles, because mocking the palace was easier than fearing it. He heard the softer thoughts too. Worry over a servant girl who limped on cold mornings. Guilt over a stable boy scolded for a mistake that hadn't been his. He said nothing about any of it. But he began watching her the way a man watches something he's afraid to name out loud. Once, catching her silently rehearsing an apology to a servant she hadn't even wronged, he found himself hoping she never learned to guard her thoughts at all. The council meeting on the 5th day changed everything. Trade reports, grain shipments, the usual grinding arithmetic of a kingdom rebuilding after war. Dorcas sat beside Luke, silent and unremarkable, exactly as the room expected, while Lord Calder, an alpha from the Eastern Holdings, recounted his territory's losses in a voice thick with rehearsed grief. Dorcas watched a new gold ring catch the light on his hand, watched him steer the conversation back toward the eastern trade routes twice, unprompted, in a report that had nothing to do with them. "He's lying," she thought. "Why?" Luke asked, so quietly no one else at the table caught it. "The ring is new. Men who've lost everything don't buy gold. And he keeps circling that road. Nobody points at something that hard unless they need people looking there instead of somewhere else." Luke's expression never changed. But that night, quiet men went through Calder's shipping ledgers, and by morning, the truth sat on Luke's desk, in neat, damning columns. A fortune skimmed from Dominion grain funds and funneled east, hidden behind losses that had never actually happened. The council was still absorbing it the next day, when one of the older alphas, watching Dorcas with something new in his expression, muttered, "Perhaps the King's Omega isn't as useless as we thought." No one laughed. No one argued. "Don't get excited," Dorcas thought immediately, eyes on her hands. "They'll find another reason to hate me by next week." Luke heard it. He said nothing, but privately, watching her fold back into silence, as though she hadn't just outthought a room of men who'd spent decades learning to lie well, one thought moved through him with quiet, dangerous certainty. They have no idea what they married into. Neither, if he was honest, had he. The Calder scandal was 3 weeks behind them, and the court still hadn't decided which unsettled them more. That a decorated alpha had been stealing from the Dominion for years, or that the king's forgotten little Omega had caught him doing it. Dorcas told herself the whispers didn't bother her. Most days she was right. But the border reports coming in that week weren't about whispers. Scouts had spotted movement along the eastern edge of the Dominion. Organized movement. Wolves in numbers too disciplined to be rogues. The council named them the Ashcourt Coalition, and said the word war so many times in one meeting that it stopped sounding like a warning and started sounding like a certainty. They wanted alliances, strong ones, blood-sealed, not paper-sealed. Dorcas wasn't seated at the table for that meeting. She stood instead just beyond the half-open door, having come to return a ledger, and stayed when she heard her own fate discussed like a line item. "The settlement bride secures nothing," Lord Ashbrook was saying. "No pack behind her worth mustering. No dominant blood to strengthen the line. Alpha Freya of Stormreach could bring 3,000 wolves to your banner by winter, your majesty. The Omega brings a ledger and a pretty face." A murmur of agreement rolled around the table. Maybe I was stupid, Dorcas thought, staring at nothing, to think he could actually want me. A treaty is a treaty. Kings trade up. Inside the chamber, Luke went very still. The thought hadn't come from beside him this time. It had come from somewhere past stone and a half-shut door, and it reached him anyway, quiet and certain, as a blade between the ribs. Something in his chest twisted, sharper than he expected, sharper than made sense for a woman he'd known 3 weeks. He set his hands flat on the table. "My queen is not being replaced." The room went silent. Ashbrook opened his mouth, reconsidered, and closed it again. Alpha Freya's wolves are welcome to muster under Dominion command, Luke continued, voice level, final. My marriage is not open for negotiation. That discussion ends now. No one argued with him. No one ever did. Underscore. That night, Dorcas found him on the private terrace off the east wing, staring out at the training grounds like the trade reports were still running behind his eyes. You didn't have to do that, she said. Say what you said, about Freya. I know. Then why did you? He turned. In the low light, his eyes were less gold, more amber, softer, somehow, without a council chamber to perform for. What do you actually think of me? He asked. Not what you say. What you think. Dorcas hesitated. It felt unfair somehow to be asked out loud for the thing he could already take without permission. I thought you were a monster, she admitted finally. The first time I saw you, I thought, this is the man they're going to feed me to. Luke didn't look offended. If anything, something in his face eased, like he'd been braced for worse. And now? Still terrifying, she thought, before she could dress it up into something kinder. He laughed. Actually laughed, low and startled out of him, like the sound didn't get much use. Fair, he said. I'll take it. It was such a small thing. A laugh, a terrace, a moment neither of them was performing for anyone, but something eased in her chest that had been clenched since the cathedral doors first opened, and for the length of one breath, the palace didn't feel like a cage at all. The symbol found her 3 days later, and she almost missed it. A wax seal on an intercepted trade correspondence, broken, discarded on a clerk's desk, bore a small black crescent, split clean through by a single line. She only noticed because she'd seen it before. Stamped faint into the lining of a guard's cloak clasped near the west gate, the one she'd assumed was decorative. Twice was a coincidence. She mentioned it to Luke anyway, because twice had started to feel like a pattern. It took his men 4 days to trace it properly. What they found wasn't a coincidence at all. A servant in the correspondence office, quietly feeding shipment schedules and guard rotations to a contact outside the palace walls. Small things, patient things. The kind of leak that meant someone had been building towards something for longer than 3 weeks. Luke had the servant taken quietly. The trail past him went cold within the hour. Whoever he answered to had covered their tracks well. This isn't finished, Dorcas said, watching Luke's face in the lamplight of his study. No, he agreed, it isn't. The message arrived the next morning, sealed in plain wax, no crest, no name. Left, somehow, inside the palace itself, where no outsider should have been able to reach. Luke read it once, then again, as though a second reading might change the words. The settlement bride will die before the winter summit. Something in him didn't rise so much as detonate. The wolf surged up beneath his skin so fast and so total that for one heartbeat, the man nearly disappeared inside it, gold flooding his eyes edge to edge, a growl building low in his chest that had nothing human left in it at all. Every guard in the corridor felt it and went rigid where they stood. Luke didn't shout. He didn't need to. Nobody touches my mate. The paper crumpled to ash in his closed fist before he'd even decided to burn it. Luke hosted the banquet 3 nights later, against the advice of every guard in the palace. Cancel it, and they'll know the threat worked, he told Dorcas, fastening the last clasp of his ceremonial coat. I'd rather they think it meant nothing to me at all. It meant everything to you, Dorcas thought, watching his jaw tighten in the mirror. You just don't want them to see it. He didn't answer that one. He didn't need to. The great hall glittered that night, the way it hadn't since the wedding. Crystal, candlelight, 100 alphas in their finest, all determined to prove nothing in the Dominion had cracked. Dorcas sat at Luke's right hand and tried to look like a queen instead of a woman counting exits. She noticed the guard first, near the western doors, one hand drifting to his hip when the room held no threat that anyone else could see. Then a servant refilling cups 2 tables down, eyes finding Luke, and sliding away too fast to be simple deference. Then Lord Penrose, laughing too loud, never quite meeting Luke's gaze when he answered him directly. Then a sleeve passed too close to Luke's goblet. Luke, "Don't drink. Someone touched your wine." He didn't glance down. He simply set the goblet aside, smooth as breathing, and reached for his water instead. And across the hall, a servant's face went carefully, deliberately blank. She never learned which of the four had meant to strike first. The first scream came from the kitchens. Then the doors slammed inward, and the banquet dissolved into chaos so fast the candlelight itself seemed to turn against them. Cloaked men pouring through every entrance, steel already drawn. Guards surged forward, tables overturned. Someone shouted her name, or his, she couldn't tell anymore, shoved one way, while Luke was swept the other. Luke! Then he was gone, and a hand closed hard around her arm. Not a guard's hand. She was dragged before she understood why. Some old instinct, recognizing the grip of someone who meant to make her disappear. A blade caught the candlelight. Pain opened along her side like a seam tearing. This is because of me, she thought, distant and strange. They want him broken, and I'm how they'll do it. She didn't feel her own fear reach him. She felt him arrive. Across the hall, Luke went still for exactly one heartbeat, long enough for her terror to slam into him through the bond like a physical blow, and then something in him stopped being a king at all. The wolf didn't rise, it erupted. His alpha aura tore through the hall like a shockwave, dropping grown men where they stood. Gold swallowed whatever remained human in his eyes. He didn't remember crossing the room. He remembered blood, and steel, and men foolish enough to stand between him and her fear, and then none of them were standing at all. He found her on the floor, one hand pressed to her side, blood dark against blue silk. He was on his knees before he'd decided to kneel. "Where are you hurt?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Dorcas. Where?" She'd never seen him afraid of anything. Not war, not a council that despised him. His hands were shaking. He's terrified, she thought, dazed. The most feared king in the Dominion. Shaking because of me. He heard that too. Something in his face broke open further still. Underscore. They took one attacker alive. A hired blade, not a believer. The kind who talked fast once a king's wolf stood inches from his throat. What he gave them by dawn turned Luke's blood to ice. The River Moon Alpha, her own father, had been in contact with the enemy coalition for months before the wedding. The settlement had never been a surrender. It had been an opening. A mate bond was a king's one true vulnerability, and her father had understood that better than anyone. He hadn't offered his daughter despite what it might cost her. He'd offered her because of what it would cost Luke. He didn't send me because no one would miss me, Dorcas realized, the thought arriving hollow and cold. He sent me because he knew exactly what I'd become to you. That was the plan all along. Luke looked at the woman bleeding in his arms, and understood, in one terrible instant, that she might have been placed there as a weapon aimed straight at his own heart. I would rather die than betray him, Dorcas thought, fierce and sudden, cutting clean through the horror of it. Whatever my father wanted, that was never me. Luke heard it, every unguarded word of it. And for the first time since the cathedral doors had opened, he let himself believe something completely. Dorcas's wound had barely closed when Luke set his trackers on the one thread they hadn't pulled yet. Where did Serena actually go? It hadn't seemed to matter before. A runaway bride. One more casualty of a war neither of them started. But a father willing to trade one daughter as a weapon made Luke wonder what he'd intended for the other. The trail wasn't clean. Serena hadn't simply fled a wedding she feared. 2 nights before the ceremony, a message had reached her, unsigned, careful, the kind of letter written by someone who knew exactly which fears to press. Whoever sent it hadn't wanted her gone out of mercy. They'd wanted her gone on schedule. She might have run because she was afraid, Dorcas said, reading the tracker's report by firelight. Or because someone convinced her to. Luke didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both already suspected which one it was. Underscore. They found Serena 4 days later, trying to cross back into Dominion territory from the east, not fleeing further, but returning, as if something had gone wrong enough to send her home. Luke's scouts brought her in quietly, and Dorcas insisted on being in the room when they questioned her. Her sister looked thinner than she remembered. frightened in a way the golden-favored daughter of Rivermoon had never once looked in Dorcas's presence. "You're alive," Serena said, staring at her like a ghost. "No thanks to you," Dorcas answered, and heard how cold it came out, and didn't take it back. It took very little pressing before the truth spilled out of her sister whole, like she'd been carrying it too long to hold any further. The marriage had never been about peace. Serena was meant to walk into Luke's palace as his trusted bride, patient and adoring, exactly the kind of wife a war-weary king would let his guard down for. Gain his trust first, learn the rhythms of his court, then, slowly, weaken him. Draw intelligence on troop movements, feed it east. Learn the palace's defenses well enough to open a door from the inside when the moment came. "I panicked," Serena said. "I never wanted to be a spy. I ran because I couldn't do it, not because I wanted you to take my place." "But you didn't warn anyone," Dorcas said quietly. "You didn't warn me." Serena had no answer for that. "I was never part of the plan," Dorcas thought, numb. Not even a backup, just an accident that happened to be standing in the hallway when they needed a body to fill a gown. Her presence had wrecked a scheme built for someone else entirely, and no one, not her father, not her sister, had cared enough to tell her any of it. They'd simply used what was already there. Hund. Lum. She didn't cry until she was alone with Luke that night. Even then, it came out as anger first, pacing his study, arms wrapped around herself like she could hold the pieces in. "They didn't just neglect me," she said. "I always knew that. I thought I was just extra, unwanted, but harmless. Something they forgot about." Her voice cracked. "But I wasn't harmless. I was disposable. There's a difference, and I didn't understand it until tonight." Luke crossed the room and stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up. "You were never the weakness in their plan," he said. "You were the mistake they made." She stared at him. "They built a scheme with careful, controlled pieces," he went on, low. "And then an Omega they'd spent 22 years ignoring walked in and burned it to the ground without even trying. That's not disposable, Dorcas. That's the one thing they never planned for." Something in her chest, wound tight since the cathedral, loosened by 1/2 inch. "I don't want to lose you," she thought, the admission arriving before she'd given herself permission to think it, raw and unguarded, and entirely true. Luke went very still. He'd heard every unguarded thought she'd had since the wedding. Fear, grief, sarcasm sharp enough to cut glass. But this was different. This one she hadn't armored at all. "You won't," he said quietly, and reached up to brush a strand of hair from her face, his hand lingering against her jaw, like he was asking permission he already half expected to be given. She didn't pull away. For one suspended moment, the space between them disappeared entirely, his breath warm against her mouth, her hand curling into the front of his coat without her permission. A guard's fist hit the door hard enough to rattle it. "Your Majesty. Urgent." They broke apart, like the moment had never happened, though neither of them managed to look unaffected by it. The news was worse than either of them wanted. 2 more names inside the palace had turned up with ties to the Eastern Coalition. And worse, whispers had reached the Winter Summit's own security detail. The conspiracy hadn't just survived the banquet attack. It had adapted, and it intended to strike where every alpha in the Dominion would be gathered under one roof. "I'm cancelling it," Luke said flatly. "No." He turned. "Dorcas, if you cancel it, they regroup somewhere we can't predict. If you hold it," she said, already thinking 3 steps ahead, "they come to us. Every conspirator in one room, all believing they've already won." She met his eyes. "We stop guessing where they'll strike. We choose the ground. You want to use yourself as bait. I want to use their arrogance against them," she thought. "They think I'm nothing. That's the only advantage I have left, and I intend to spend it." Luke studied her for a long moment. The woman his enemies had underestimated from the very first veil. Standing in front of him, proposing to walk directly into the trap meant to kill her. Something that wasn't quite fear, and wasn't quite pride, moved through his chest. He smiled, slow and sharp, every inch the king his enemies feared. "Then let's hunt them." The week before the Winter Summit disappeared into planning, that happened almost entirely in silence. Luke trusted exactly 5 people with the truth. His second-in-command, 2 trackers who'd proven themselves since the banquet, the healer who'd stitched Dorcas's side closed, and Dorcas herself. Everyone else, the court, the household guard, the nobles already arriving to prepare their delegations, would see exactly what the conspiracy expected to see. A settlement bride too fragile to matter. A king distracted by grief. A palace with its guard quietly, carelessly down. Dorcas played the part without effort. She'd had 22 years of practice being underestimated. Folding back into it felt less like acting than coming home. Let them watch me flinch at raised voices, she thought, keeping her eyes lowered through a council session designed to be overheard by the wrong ears. Let them think the Omega is still just decoration. It's the only advantage I have left, and I intend to spend every last coin of it. Luke, 3 seats away, gave no sign he'd heard her at all. That, too, was becoming its own kind of language between them. Underscore. They didn't need to stand close anymore to work as one. She'd notice a guard rotation that didn't match the roster, and by the time she'd finished the thought, Luke was already moving to correct it. He'd catch the edge of unease in a servant's posture across a crowded hall, and somehow she'd know to watch that servant's hands for the rest of the evening. Neither of them announced what they were doing. They simply did it, 2 halves of the same instinct, until the trusted few around them stopped being surprised by how rarely they needed to speak at all. It should have frightened her, how naturally it had happened. Instead, it felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on since the cathedral. Underscore. The first real catch came 4 nights before the summit. A household guard, caught passing a folded schedule of Luke's movements to a courier outside the east gate. Under questioning, he broke almost immediately. Too immediately, Dorcas thought, watching from the shadow of the doorway. He gave up everything with the relief of a man glad to finally stop carrying it. Payment in foreign coin, instructions delivered through dead drops, loyalty to the Eastern Coalition, and nothing beyond that. The room exhaled. Luke's second-in-command called it a victory. For one night, even Luke allowed himself to believe the threat had a single face, and they'd just found it. Dorcas didn't sleep. A household guard doesn't have access to the king's private movement schedule, she thought, staring at the ceiling of her chambers. Someone gave him that, someone who already had it. In the morning, she said as much to Luke, and watched the same doubt she'd been carrying settle onto his face. They went back to the prisoner together. This time, Luke didn't ask gently. The alpha command in his voice was a physical thing, pressing the guard back against the stone wall of his cell until whatever resolve he had left simply gave out. I never spoke to anyone from the coalition, he admitted, voice cracking. Only to a man inside these walls. He gave the orders. He paid me. He told me what to say if I was caught. Who? Luke said. Not a question, a command. The guard's eyes found Dorcas first, as if she'd already guessed, and he was only confirming it. Commander Vane. Silence dropped over the cell like a physical weight. Roderick Vane had served Luke's family since before Luke could walk unassisted. He'd taught Luke to hold a blade before he'd taught him to read. He commanded the royal guard, oversaw every layer of the palace's security, knew Luke's schedule, his weaknesses, his blind spots, better than Luke knew them himself. No, Luke said, and for the first time since the cathedral, Dorcas heard something in his voice crack that had nothing to do with fear. Not Roderick. He's family. He carried me on his shoulders before I could walk. I know what he means to you, Dorcas said quietly. I'm not asking you to hate him. I'm asking you to look. He has no reason. He has access, she said, to your movements, to the guards, to the summit's entire security. Everyone the conspiracy needed on the inside. One man already has, freely, because you'd never think to question him. She stepped closer. That's not proof. But it fits, Luke, and nothing else does. Luke turned away from her, jaw tight, every instinct in him rebelling against the shape of what she was suggesting. You don't have to believe me, Dorcas said aloud. Just watch him, she thought, softer, meant only for him. That's all I'm asking. Watch, and let him prove me wrong. Beneath Luke's ribs, low and wordless, The wolf stirred, and did not argue with her. It never had, not once, not from the very first thought it had heard inside a cathedral. It simply agreed, quiet and absolute, in a way the man was still catching up to. Luke said nothing, but he didn't refuse her either. The winter summit opened 3 days later, beneath 10,000 candles, the great hall swollen with alphas from every pack in the Dominion, silver and fur, and old rivalries dressed up as diplomacy. Dorcas stood at Luke's side exactly as the court expected, quiet, decorative, unthreatening, while her eyes moved through the crowd with a precision no one there thought her capable of. She found Roderick Vane near the ceremonial platform, composed as ever, every inch the loyal commander he'd been for 30 years. Then she saw his hand lift, briefly, 2 fingers turned toward a man near the western pillar, a signal, small enough to be nothing at all, unless you already knew to be watching for it. The man near the pillar moved, so did 3 others, drifting into position with the unhurried calm of men who believed they still had time. Dorcas's pulse climbed, but her face didn't change. Luke, it's happening. Right now. The trap isn't ours anymore. It's already closing. 10,000 candles burned above the great hall, and beneath them stood the entire Dominion. Alphas from every pack, old rivals dressed in diplomacy's borrowed clothes, crystal chandeliers scattering light across silver and fur. To the court, Dorcas was exactly what she'd always been on the king's arm. Decoration, silent, unthreatening, easily overlooked. No one in that hall knew she and Luke hadn't stopped speaking since they'd walked through the doors. Her eyes moved where the courts never had, past faces, into hands, into boots, into the small, telling ticks of men who believed no one watched them closely enough to matter. 3 men near the eastern colonnade wore identical silver rings, plain enough to vanish, in a room full of jewels. The same ring she'd seen on the hand of a guard who'd broken under questioning 3 nights ago. Guards she knew from the roster stood in the wrong places. Doors that should have been covered stood open, and near the ceremonial platform, composed as ever, stood Commander Roderick Vane, the only man in the Dominion with access to arrange every piece of it. This isn't an assassination, Dorcas realized, cold and complete. If Luke dies here, in front of every alpha in the Dominion, with Rivermoon already suspected, they don't just lose a king. Someone else fills his seat before the blood's dry, and no one will ever prove who moved first. A coup, wearing a summit's clothes. Luke. Now. He moved before the thought had finished landing. The ballroom tore open. Traitors shed their masks of diplomacy all at once, steel flashing beneath crystal light. Guards surged. Wolves shifted mid-stride, fur and fury replacing silk in a single heartbeat. The chandeliers shuddered with the force of it. Luke unleashed everything he'd held back for weeks. His alpha aura rolled through the hall like a struck bell, dropping lesser wolves where they stood, gold burning through his eyes edge to edge. Dorcas moved through the chaos beside him, and yet apart from him, unremarkable, unthreatening, exactly what the conspirators had always assumed her to be, and precisely why none of them saw her directing loyal guards toward the doors that mattered. She never saw Vane approach. She simply turned, and he was there, blocking her path to the platform, utterly calm inside a room falling apart around him. "Clever," he said, almost admiring. "All of it. I underestimated you the same way everyone else did." "You still are," Dorcas said. Vane smiled, thin and humorless. "An Omega, on the throne beside the most powerful king in the Dominion. Do you know how long I've served this family? I watched Luke's father build something real, and I will not watch it handed to a woman who was never meant to be queen. That's where you made your mistake." His hand moved. She saw the blade too late to fully step clear, felt it catch her arm instead of her throat, pain blooming white and sharp. And then Vane was gone, wrenched backward off his feet by something too fast to see. Luke's roar shook the chandeliers. He had Vane by the throat before Dorcas's knees fully understood they should buckle, gold-eyed and shaking with a fury that had nothing measured left in it. The wolf wanted blood. The king, for once, wasn't arguing. "Luke, don't," she thought, forcing the word through pain and static. If he dies here, the whole network dies with him. We need him alive. We need him talking. It cost him visibly. She watched restraint fight instinct across every line of his face, but his grip eased from a killing hold to a captor's. You're the only reason he still breathes, Luke told Vane, voice like ice cracking underfoot. By the time the guards dragged Vane away, the coup was already collapsing. Conspirators surrendered or fell. Loyal wolves reclaimed the hall room by room. Within the hour, confessions confirmed what Dorcas had suspected since the correspondence office. A network built patiently across seasons, funded by the Eastern Coalition, and rooted, from its very first thread, in Rivermoon. Her father lost his title before dawn. Rivermoon's leadership was dissolved by midday. Its remaining loyal wolves absorbed quietly into neighboring packs. The war that had nearly reshaped the Dominion ended not on a battlefield, but in a ballroom, because one overlooked Omega had refused to stop watching. Dorcas found the eastern balcony hours later, her arm bandaged, the noise of the palace finally fading beneath falling snow. The danger was over. The conspiracy was gone. Rivermoon, her father, the treaty that had started all of it, finished. So what happens now, she thought, too tired to guard it. He kept me when keeping me mattered. Now the danger's gone. Will he still want me when I'm not useful anymore? Luke heard every word of it, standing 2 corridors away, with his hand still unsteady from the fight. He didn't answer through the bond. He went to find her instead. The battle noise had long since drained out of the palace, leaving only snow falling silent past the windows. Dorcas stood on the same eastern balcony, where months ago she'd first wondered whether this feared king could ever want anything from her beyond a name stitched into someone else's wedding gown. She let herself remember that girl now, veiled, borrowed, terrified, standing at an altar in a dress that had never fit her, waiting to be handed over like a debt finally called due. Nobody had asked that girl what she wanted. Nobody ever had. Footsteps approached, unhurried, familiar. She didn't need to turn to know it was him. She felt him the way she always had now, warmth arriving a half step before the sound. He'd left the crown behind somewhere in the palace's wreckage. No ceremonial coat, no gold-eyed king handing down verdicts to a trembling court. Just Luke, sleeves pushed to his forearms, exhaustion carved into every line of his face, looking at her like she was the only steady thing left standing after a night that had nearly cost him everything. He came to the rail beside her, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. If the treaty had never existed, Luke said finally, no war, no settlement, no father dragging you into a dress that was never yours. He turned to look at her. Would you still have chosen me? Always, Dorcas thought, the answer arriving before she'd even finished deciding to give it. Luke went still. He'd heard 1,000 of her thoughts by now. Fear, sarcasm, grief dressed up as jokes about execution rooms. This one landed differently, and for once, he didn't tease her for thinking too loudly. Say it, he said quietly, out loud. I want to hear you choose it, not just think it. She turned to face him fully. I choose you. Something eased behind his eyes, like a breath he'd been holding since the cathedral finally let go. I kept you, at first, because exposing you meant war, he admitted. Then because my wolf chose you before I'd even decided to look at you twice, and I didn't know how to argue with something that certain. His hand found hers on the rail. Then, because I started admiring you, how you saw what a council full of grown alphas missed, how you never once asked me to fight your battles for you. His voice dropped lower, but somewhere between that cathedral and tonight, all of that stopped being the reason. He looked at her, unguarded in a way she'd never once seen. I stayed because I fell in love with you. Dorcas's breath caught. The settlement is over, Luke went on, before she could answer. Rivermoon has no leverage left to hold over you, and I won't hold a treaty over your head either. You don't owe me a crown, or a bond, or anything else. None of this was ever something you chose for yourself. He held her gaze, steady despite what it clearly cost him. If you want to leave this palace, I'll see you protected wherever you go. No conditions, no punishment. Just a choice, finally, that belongs to you alone. She studied him, the most feared king in the Dominion, offering her the one thing no one in her life had ever thought to give her, the freedom to walk away. I don't want to leave, she thought, and let him hear every word of it. I never did. I just needed to know that I could. I'm not your settlement bride anymore, she said aloud. No, Luke agreed, reaching up to touch her face like she might vanish if he moved too quickly. You're my queen. She didn't step back. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him despite the snow, and tilted her head, baring her throat to him without needing to be asked. Luke went very still, gold eyes searching hers one last time, silently asking a question he didn't need to voice. Always, she thought again, loud and certain. And this time, it was answer enough. His mouth found the curve of her neck, gentle before it wasn't, and when his mark closed over her skin, the world seemed to fold in on itself and open again somewhere entirely new. She felt him, all of him, flood into her at once. Every fear he'd buried beneath crowns and duty. Every quiet night he'd spent believing love was a luxury kings rarely lived long enough to keep. The terror that had seized him the instant her blood hit the ballroom floor, and beneath it, older and steadier than any of it, a devotion that had been building since the very first unguarded thought he'd ever stolen from her mind. And Luke felt her in return. Every year of being overlooked, every quiet ache of believing herself unwanted, and underneath it all, a courage she had never once given herself credit for. Beneath his skin, the wolf that had chased her thoughts since the cathedral finally went still, settling into something that had stopped searching, because at last, it had arrived. The following morning, snow still drifting soft over the palace grounds, the entire Dominion gathered beneath the great hall's chandeliers to watch their king do something none of them had ever once seen him do. Alphas who had called her the settlement, who had dismissed her as a weak wolf with no value at any table, stood in silence as Luke lifted a crown from its cushion and turned to face her. Months ago, in a cathedral far from this hall, a command had rolled through cold stone, remove the veil. A frightened girl in a stolen gown, hidden from a king who was never supposed to want her. Now Luke lifted a crown instead, and settled it gently over hair no veil would ever need to hide again. She was no longer someone's sacrifice, no longer a settlement paid to end a war. Somewhere in the crowd, the empty space where her father's title used to sit went unmourned. She let it go. It didn't sting anymore. I was never the forgotten daughter, she thought, finding Luke's eyes across the hall. I was just waiting for someone to finally look. She was Queen Dorcas Blackwood, mate of the Alpha King, and every alpha in that hall bowed low before her. Beneath Luke's ribs, the wolf gave its final, quiet verdict. The only two words it had ever truly needed. Mine. Home. If you enjoyed the story, let me know in the comments. Your voice decides what I write next. Don't forget to subscribe if you want more moonlit love stories like this one.